Okay, sorry about that. My screen just did something funny, just because it could. I wanted to just spend a little time doing some Q&A and getting a chance to talk to everybody about down the research rabbit hole. That's a theme I have on my blog and I often write about, getting lost in the research rabbit hole and what that means both as a writer and you know, how that ends up coming out in work. It seems like no matter what you write, there's a research rabbit hole to get lost in. Whether you're writing Regency, I have friends who write mysteries and thrillers, and they will end up down the research rabbit hole even though they're writing in the modern era, because there are just so many little details that we need to flesh out the books, because sometimes what we research ends up being really important for plot points. And sometimes it ends up being more about setting the scene and bringing the reader down into the world that we're creating. And both of those things are a lot of fun. And one of my favorite parts about doing this thing that we do, I get excited for the research opportunities, and sometimes I have to say, no, you don't get to research until you get this part finished, because once you start opening that up, it just kind of keeps going and going and going. In the book I've just finished, which is the last of my dragon series, yeah, I'm kind of way out on a limb compared to everybody else I'm writing my dragons. And as I'm writing along, I realized I needed a source of gold. Like, okay, where am I going to find that? What are the chances that there might possibly have been a shipwreck or a buried treasure somewhere? And this is probably the one time in modern history that there's ever been a shipwreck showing up at exactly the right point in history, in exactly the right place at the right time. And it says I was looking for what I needed for the plot to work. All of a sudden, there's a shipwreck off the English coast of Cornwall that happened exactly when I needed it to happen. And more amazingly, it was carrying a load of gold. And it still hasn't been found today. It's like, okay, this can't be possible. This is exactly what I need. And in pulling out all those details, all of a sudden the plot kind of took a left-hand turn and decided to go in a slightly different direction. But it was so much fun. And it was so exciting to discover all these details that now they both wove the story and got woven into the story at the same time. Oh, thanks, Carol. I've got at least a couple more dragon books that I'm kind of cooking up in the back of my mind. But the shipwreck, I think, is only going to be for this book. But, you know, like everybody's been saying, never say never. Napoleon is still out there lurking. And, you know, I have found myself researching things that I didn't actually think I was interested in. The current thread is looking at Napoleon and escaping the exile on Elba. And I'm down these research rabbit holes thinking, there's no other reason that I would have dove into this information, but it just becomes so fascinating. And there are little things that you pick up along the way that you never expect, like some of the historical basis of artificial respiration that we think of today, rescue breathing, actually was around in the Regency era. And it was called the kiss of life, which became part of a major plot point in one of my books as a way to not exactly compromise the heroine, but sort of, because she performed rescue breathing on the hero who had been trapped in a fire. And the whole idea of rescue breathing was extremely, it was very improper, obviously, for the era where you barely touched gloved hands. to do artificial respiration or rescue breathing like that was very discouraged, even though it worked, but it was so improper, people just couldn't wrap their minds around it. But if you look at some of the historical works, particularly some of the medical treatises, I think it was in Buchanan's treatise on domestic health that talked about it. The practice was there. So there's a lot of very surprisingly modern things that happened in the Regency that we often don't think of. And when we come across them, sometimes it's a question of, okay, do I put this in a story because nobody's going to think it fits. Nobody's going to think it's historically accurate if I talk about it, because it's not a well-known part of the era. In one of my more recent books, I just kind of ended up looking into archery. You remember the scene in Gwyneth Paltrow's Emma, where she and Knightley are shooting arrows into the target and she nearly shoots Knightley's dog. And I just got fascinated with that. And I thought, I wonder how accurate this portrayal was. And that research rabbit hole went really, really deep. I ended up into some master's theses and some academic works talking about the role that a new interest in archery played in Regency society. And what was really, really cool in that was that archery was one of the very, very few sports that women were not just tolerated in, but encouraged to participate in. There were archery societies throughout England, and a number of them, you can look in their the rule books for the society and see that they permitted women into those societies. And there were a few societies that were actually just women. And I see Carol's question, why was that? And why was which? Why was what? You mean the archery, why they were allowed to participate in archery? Is that what you're asking? Okay, they were allowed to participate in archery because it was a graceful and beautiful sport. You didn't really break a sweat, and it aligned with all the ideals of beauty in the era. Off on another bunny trail here, actually it was that same book now that I think about it, looking at what defined beauty in the era. Like today, we have have had very clear ideas of what is beautiful and what is not, what body type is appropriate, what manner of dress and makeup and so forth. Each era has defined beauty in different ways. And for a particular plot line, I needed to identify what was beautiful in the era. And in the Regency era, it was all about classical Greek lines. That's what suddenly became extremely popular after the French Revolution and after the Enlightenment. All these classics, the Greek classics came to light. And so the long, lean lines of the the Regency era gowns that are, very column-like with the very high waists and not a lot of structure were hearkening back to the ideals of the Greek and Roman beauty. So excellent posture and holding yourself very erect and very graceful were some of the key ideas of beauty in the era. To move gracefully, to be very straight, the idea of holding books on your head for good posture, that kind of originated there. There were actually books for women that talked about exercises, and there were even exercise machines in the era developed to assist women in developing the right kind of posture and the right kind of movement. So all of that comes back to Archery being a way that a woman could show off those ideals of beauty and grace. So it was an acceptable sport for women. Running and things that left you huffing and puffing and red in the face and perspiring and disheveled were not ladylike. They weren't beautiful. And so women were not encouraged to participate in those kinds of things. And it would even go so far in terms of a Regency gown, particularly in the 1810, 1812, the waistlines had gone as high as they possibly could go. You ran into some landscape there and you just couldn't get them any higher. Well, daytime gowns weren't really a problem because you had a fairly high neckline during the day. And the later in the day you went and the more formal the gown, the lower and lower and lower the neckline started to go, till you just about had the neckline at the oops line. So you might have a bodice that was just a few inches across. Well, you introduce physics and gravity into this, and you have the potential for what we call today wardrobe malfunctions. And so there were certain activities that women did not engage in for fear of wardrobe malfunction. One of those was playing the violin. Women did not play the violin because you lift your arms and you have the violin under your chin. That is a recipe for a wardrobe malfunction, particularly if you're relatively well endowed. That's just not going to work very well because, okay, see, I'm bouncing off all these bunny trails here because it all starts to tie together as you've run down enough of the bunny trails, the rabbit warren starts making sense and you start seeing how all these things are linked. So going back a step, the Regency corset is not a Victorian corset. The Victorian corset was all about the curves and the waistline and was designed to create a very narrow waist and kind of a pigeon breast and a full bustle. That was the Victorian shape of beauty. That is nothing like a Regency shape of beauty. In that very short window of the Regency era, which roughly we're talking about 1780 to 1830, which I know was not the political Regency, it was the era of cultural influence. Would probably be the best way to describe it, is roughly 1780 to 1830, when we start kicking into the Victorian era. The real Regency was just the 9 years of Regency where the Prince Regent held for the king. But we're talking more of the culture here. Anyway, the corsets that were worn in that period were to reinforce that column-like shape. So they weren't about cinching in the waist. They were all about lifting the bust. So those corsets were essentially like today's long line push-up bras. And so quoting a writer from the period, they offered up the bosom like apples on a platter, was how it was described. So the whole idea of the undergarments were to shove the bust up as high as you could go because you had the waist of the garment up so high. So everything is pushed up and swelling out the neckline. And you've got this extremely low neckline, and sometimes it's cut very wide to the shoulders, particularly in evening gowns. So women had to be very, very careful in the way that they would move. So you didn't do anything which lifted your arms up like play a violin. Flutes don't work either because, again, you've got to lift your arms, and that can create problems. And any wind instrument would risk you puffing out your cheeks and getting red in the face. That was not part of beauty. That was not considered beautiful. So women would play things like the pianoforte, which you can play in very graceful seated position without any risks to your wardrobe. Women also played the harp. which was actually considered a higher class of instrument than the pianoforte, in part because it was more expensive and was harder to get. Fewer women had access to a harp. So because it was more exclusive, it was considered a higher class of instrument. In Persuasion, we have a scene where the younger Musgrove girls, Henrietta and Louisa, are excited because their parents have acquired a harp and they're rearranging the parlor, moving the pianoforte out of place and replacing it with a harp. And Mrs. Musgrove is saying, I don't understand why I need to make room for this thing. And like Abigail began this session, that's one of those kinds of hidden context things that we see happening in Austen, where a little statement like that reflects a lot more than we see in our modern eyes. One of the things Austen tells us is that the Musgroves were of the older style. The parents were of the old style. And that was very much a culture where people were not upwardly mobile. You stayed within the confines of where you were born. The young people were entering into a much more economically mobile society where we start to see the rise of the merchant class, the rise of the Industrial Revolution, and the economics are changing. And so they were, in Austen's words, part of the new class, or not the new class, but the new fashion. So the old-fashioned parents who are very content with their piano and the girls who have been off to school acquire this harp, which is an upper-class instrument that they're now playing and excited to play, as showing their wealth, their accomplishments, and their hopes to move in society. So it's a very subtle little thing that we see happening there. But women can play the harp because you're extending your arms forward and it's a very graceful motion, which again ties into what was considered beautiful in the era. Something that I didn't expect, but you actually see in a fair number of era portraits, is the guitar. You very rarely hear or read about a heroine playing the guitar, but it was considered an instrument appropriate for ladies. Again, it's very graceful. It, an upright posture. You don't get red in the face. But that's going to be a less expensive instrument. And so it doesn't have the prestige of playing the piano, or even better, playing the harp. The harp also showed up in Mansfield Park with Mary Crawford, who was having her harp brought in and was upset that she couldn't find anybody to bring it in for her because everybody was out bringing in the crops. So all the carts and horses were tied up doing productive work. And Mary's emphasis on her harp is a way of Austen showing us that Mary is distanced herself from any form of reality and is trying to function in this sphere which is totally disconnected from real life. And so it's an insight into her character that we might not otherwise recognize through the instrument that she plays. I see a question here from Patty about the book with the rescue breathing. That one was Less Agreeable Man. It was the third one in the Queen of Rosings Park series. And Rita asks, which are the most reliable resources for the Regency? That's a tongue twister, you know? That's a really good question, Rita. And I would have to say that the first go-to that I really want to find is material written in the period itself, not filtered through multiple hands and multiple interpretations. Going to original source material is almost always the best that you're going to find. Now that can be challenging. There are a lot of digitized materials available. I like the Google Play for that because there's a lot of period material. things like Ackerman's magazines, the ladies magazine, Ackerman's. There's a men's magazine as well, and I think it's just called the Gentleman's Magazine. And there's sporting magazines, Le Bon Ton. There's one major magazine that I'm just not remembering the name of right now. But all of those have multiple editions available on Google Play. And one of the things that I love to do is just to look at and see what were they writing about. It's like taking a volume of Ladies Home Journal today and looking to see just what are the articles that they're writing. So that gives an insight about what were things that were important to people, what were important things to women and men who were reading these things of the day. There's a few period reproductions. A Mirror of Graces is a book written in, I think it's 1811. And that one I have a reproduction of, but it's a fascinating etiquette manual for young women that really reveals a lot about what was considered beautiful, what kind of behavior was important, what was considered vulgar in the era. It talks a lot about appropriate manners. That one, I have to admit, I had a hard time tracing down because a lot of those copies were just so expensive. I mean, you could spend a lot of money on chasing down original material like that. So I try hard to find electronic resources. Period cookbooks, believe it or not, are another fantastic resource because many of those books are not just cookbooks, but they're also, they have sections on home medicine. So recipes for nursing, nursing invalids and so forth. They have discussions of how to create cleaning supplies, homemade cleaning supplies. You know, I have my vinegar and water and detergent solution that I spray in my kitchen. And they have pages and pages and pages of home recipes for stain removal. They actually had ways to dry clean silk in the era because you can't just wash a silk gown. So they had different preparations to remove stains from silk. Manuals for servants are another fascinating resource. There's, just checking, make sure this isn't another question. The Duties of the Female Servant, I think is the title of one of those. That is basically a manual on the duties, the jobs of a female servant, which would usually be a maid, an upstairs maid, downstairs maid, or maid of all work, and a couple of the cooking chores as well. And this particular book would detail from the morning that the poor girl got up till the moment she fell exhausted back into bed, what exactly she would be doing and how she would be doing it. And that actually I used a lot in the Trouble to Check Her because there was a lot of housework in that book. And they didn't do housework the way we did today. One of the things I found really fascinating in that one was in order to clean a room, there was an awful lot of sweeping involved. And before you would sweep anything, you would cover all the furniture with dust cloths. Like you would if you were going to paint, you put drop cloths on the furniture. It was the same sort of thing. You would cover the furniture with drop cloths. You would pin up the curtains off of the floor, and you might cover the bottoms of the curtain with cloths to protect them, because there was a tremendous amount of dust in the air from fires and from wood fires and from coal. The smoke and the ash were just everywhere. So if you swept a room without protecting all the furniture, you'd put all the dust onto the furniture, the upholstery, which you can't clean very well. So you would put dust cloths on everything. Then you would take either dampened sand. You actually would buy sand for cleaning purposes. There would be salespeople, tradespeople, often tradeswomen, who would sell different kinds of sand for cleaning purposes. Some of it was, kind of the obvious, you scour with it, but also you would take damp sand or sometimes damp used tea leaves and throw it on the floor before you swept, which seemed a little counterintuitive. I'm sweeping the floor. Why do I want to put more on the floor now than there was when I started? Well, the reason you would do that, and this was, it took me a while to find a resource that would explain why you did it. The sand and the tea leaves would capture the dust and would help lock it into place. So when you swept, it would hold the dust in place so you could actually sweep it up. So instead of throwing the dust all over the rest of the room, you'd actually be able to sweep it up and get it out of the room. And that had to be done fairly frequently because with all heat and cooking coming from some sort of fire, whether it was a coal fire, which actually the advent of coal made things a lot worse because of the dust and the smoke. You had a tremendous amount of dust and soot in the air. Agnes was saying, yeah, in the Trouble to Checker, Lydia had a lot to do, but you're right, it didn't even touch the surface of what the house cleaning actually looked like in the time. And I love bringing in those little tiny details because it helps for me when I read a book and have those kinds of details. We talked about writing what you like to read. I like something that grabs me and pulls me into the world that's being written. And for me, those kinds of details pull me in so I can't get back out. I am there, I am fixed, and I'm fascinated by what's going on. So that's what keeps bringing me back to the research rabbit hole. And I am now out of time. That's what happens when you get me talking about all the research stuff. I can just go and go and go and go, and someone has to stop me. So I am going to officially stop and pass the banner here back to Abigail, because we have got a play coming up here, which I am looking forward to, with Siri and Diana and Paul. That Abigail, you want to go ahead and introduce them?
Sure.